sont avec nous depuis Paris. Je salue tout d'abord Manuel Valls, ancien Premier ministre français qui est avec nous. Bonjour Manuel Valls.
Bonjour.
Hello.
Je salue juste à côté de vous Abnousse Shalmani qui est écrivaine, chroniqueuse qu'on connaît bien évidemment sur IHRD News. Bonjour Abnousse.
Bonjour.
Hello. Et à côté de vous également Raphael, Enthoven, écrivain qui est avec nous également. Bonjour à vous.
Bonjour. Merci
Hello.
de votre invitation.
Thank you for inviting
Alors,
me.
on va justement essayer d'évoquer tous ensemble d'abord ce que représente aujourd'hui cette journée de commémoration de l'Holocauste, de la Shoah. Manuel Valls, quel est pour vous justement le rapport et le rôle que doit avoir une telle journée ?
Au fond, comme tous les journées de commémoration,
Like any other Remembrance Day, it is a very important moment in time to remember the victims, their loved ones.
c'est un moment historique, celui de la libération du camp
The
d'Auschwitz.
liberation of the Auschwitz camp is a historical moment. And of course, like all of these Remembrance Days, it's an important day in the time we're living in today. History doesn't repeat itself, but it stumbles. We do see that there are troubles, a democratic crisis in all countries. Anti-Semitism is coming back in different forms, especially now with the pandemic, and anti-Semitism always announces great hardships. So we have to remember and to prepare ourselves again, politically and morally, to fight anti-Semitism.
Combattre cet antisémitisme.
Abnousse Shalmani, alors vous êtes d'origine iranienne. L'Iran, on sait que c'est un pays où on n'enseigne pas énormément, pour ne pas dire pas du tout d'ailleurs, la Shoah. Qu'est-ce que représente pour vous cette journée ?
Alors, moi, surtout en tant que Française que je vais réagir.
I'm going to answer as a French citizen because I arrived in France when I was 8 years old and I never returned to Iran. But I still have family living there, and of course I have links with my home country. My story is very particular. As opposed to many Iranians, I discovered the Holocaust when I was young because my grandfather was Sufi and used to go to a bookstore. In 1958, he brought back a book that told the history of the Holocaust to my father, who was 10 years old. And I can tell you, I have been looking for this book for many years. So my grandfather was shaken, and he told the story to my father. And so it became like a family tradition. His father told him, and then my father told it to me too when I was 7 years old. There was a Jewish Iranian girl in my class, and she was bullied, and my father gave me the mission to take her defense. So the Holocaust became a part of our family story, and when I arrived in France, I chose to study history because I had to understand how I became an exile, an immigrant in France. Obviously, this was the typical story of a family troubled by history, and this has to do with all the movements in history that create immigrants. This tragedy touched me when I was a little girl, especially because I had to deal with Holocaust denial. And slowly but surely, anti-Semitism transformed into a misuse, an abuse. And we see it on social media. This is what Manuel Valls has said. Now, with the pandemic, we see yellow stars reappearing on social media. And it is a way of playing down the Holocaust. It has to do with Holocaust denial. But we have also seen in 2019, in the streets of Paris, Muslim protesters bearing the yellow star. So it's very important not only to remember, as Manuel said, but also to use all of our weapons to arm ourselves, because when anti-Semitism comes back, it announces a tragedy for humanity.
Alors évidemment, on va parler de ça, on va s'arrêter sur cette problématique que vous évoquez, c'est-à-dire notamment à l'occasion de cette pandémie de coronavirus, la manière avec laquelle sont détournés les symboles de la Shoah. Raphael, Enthoven, c'est pour vous le danger principal cette année sur lequel il faut mettre l'accent à l'occasion de cette journée ?
Alors oui, bien sûr. J'ajouterai une chose dans le sillage.
Yes, of course, but I would like to add something to what my colleagues have just said. I think it's essential to stop exploiting the Holocaust. The fact that some people dare to compare the situation of those who are against vaccination to the situation of the Jewish people during World War II is a red line that has been crossed. This is tragic because they believe they are right when they do so.
C'est-à-dire qu'un régime où chacun peut avoir le sentiment de détenir la vérité, c'est autorisé à franchir. Ceci est tragique.
Abnousse is absolutely right when she mentions the Muslims who protested against Islamophobia using the yellow star in November 2019. The misuse of the symbol is very serious, and it's not only shameful, it's also dangerous because it plays down the absolute crime and the issue, which is a collective issue, not just a community issue, is to stop exploiting the Holocaust, to go back to history as much as we can, and to convey what history tells us. We will talk later about how to do it, but this is the essential part. The essential thing here is the fact that the Holocaust is not a tool and that people don't have the right to use it. Nobody should abuse it.
Vous n'avez pas le droit de vous en servir. Nul n'a le droit de s'en servir.
Bon, et c'est quelque chose sur lequel on n'a pas d'emprise, si on voit justement l'ampleur que cela prend aujourd'hui. Manuel Valls, justement, on a l'impression que le pouvoir politique, le pouvoir législatif, se montre assez impuissant finalement à empêcher à chaque fois qu'on utilise ces symboles de la Shoah, qu'on utilise ces comparaisons absolument honteuses, quels que soient finalement les sujets. Là, c'est le coronavirus ou le pass vaccinal, mais ça pourrait être autre chose. Pourquoi est-ce que le pouvoir politique semble impuissant justement à empêcher cela?
Ça pourrait être autre chose, évidemment, mais
yes, it could be any other context, but paradoxically, when I was young, I used to live in the 4th neighborhood of Paris. I went to a primary school, which was located in front of the memorial of the unknown Jewish martyr, but no one mentioned the Holocaust at school. The first time I heard about it was on TV, in a wonderful series called Holocaust. I also remember another film that was shown a few years before when I was in high school.
Avait été diffusé quelques années auparavant. Je me rappelle du choc au ciné-club de mon lycée. Aujourd'hui, il y a des...
And since then, we do have Holocaust survivors who come to share the story of the Holocaust with children. The laws regarding the denial of the Holocaust are quite severe, so our society has done things about it during the last few years.
Ces 20 dernières années, il y a eu un mouvement de reprise de l'antisémitisme, essentiellement venant du monde.
But in the last 20 years, there has been a movement that has made a comeback of the anti-Semitism, together with Islamism and the far left. We can see that in our country, and this movement led to terror attacks. We heard people chanting "Death to the Jews" in Paris in 2014. We have seen people who died.
L'islam politique, l'islamisme, d'ailleurs, a commis une alliance.
Political Islamism has made an alliance with the far right and the far left, and anti-Semitism has become the ideological base of Islamism. And once again, Jews were murdered again. French Jews were murdered just because they were Jews.
Donc, on a changé de paradigme d'une certaine manière.
So we have to fight at every level, political and legislative, of course. We should not stop and we should not be too indulgent, but we have to rally the whole society.
This is what I wanted to say.
It's not acceptable, and you're absolutely right. Exploiting and abusing these symbols morally has to be fought at the political level as well.
And I would like to add that the law is not enough.
Parce que la loi n'y suffit pas.
Exactement.
La loi n'y suffit
Exactly.
pas. C'est à l'ancien Premier ministre que je le dis, vous le savez mieux que nous.
The law is not enough. You have been Prime Minister. You know better than us that the law cannot solve all the problems related to anti-Semitism. For instance, when René Chiche, who is a philosophy professor, says for the first time since the laws for the Jews from 1940s, citizens who didn't violate any law are punished and can't have access to some places just because they're not vaccinated, it's a step towards hell. When someone writes such nonsense, a man who teaches philosophy makes such an analogy, it is totally crazy. He is still within the framework of the law, and the law cannot punish this. This is not reprehensible from a legal point of view, but we have to fight this, ideologically speaking, and by teaching people. Manuel Valls is absolutely right. The entire society has to be involved. In France, certain things are defended by law and fought against by citizens, and the other way around. In this case, it's the same. To fight anti-Semitism, we must use education. So the law is not enough. That's quite right.
Yes, the law is not enough. There is a cultural movement which is there in the relativization of the Holocaust. This idea of white privilege that comes from the United States. I want to remind you that the Jewish community represents 2% of the population in the US. And according to FBI statistics from 2020, half of the crimes related to religion are perpetrated against Jews, which is huge. Nowadays, we only consider things through a victim context. And Jews are white, so they are considered as being part of white privilege. So the law is not enough. And we need to use teaching. So the law is not enough. And we need to use teaching and pedagogy to fight that.
Yes, it's a scandal. People talk about Judaism and the whites.
Exactly. But people forget that there are Ethiopian Jews. Miss Israel is a black woman, but that doesn't concern anyone. Nobody remembers that. People just remember the conflict with Palestinians. And we have seen activists beating Jewish people in the streets of New York. It's crazy. I was very shocked by something that happened. Dave Chappelle, an American comedian who is very talented and who won several Emmy Awards, converted to Islam. In October, half of the employees at Netflix went on a strike because they considered his show transphobic. So I decided to have a look to form an opinion. And I didn't think that the show was transphobic. But it was definitely anti-Semitic.
Really? I didn't watch it.
For instance, Dave Chappelle says that he is going to direct a film about very ancient people who decide to leave Earth and to go and live on another planet. When they arrive there, they are not treated well and go through horrible things. So they come back to Earth. And they call the place, quote, Space Jew. And then you hear someone from the audience who says, quote, Free Palestine. Apart from Jewish media, no media, nor The Guardian, nor the New York Times, mention this sequence that is so anti-Semitic. And there are no complaints. After 10 days on Netflix, there were 10 million views, and there was a satisfaction rate of 43% from film critics and 95% from the audience. So in the newspapers, there was no warning that this program was full of anti-Semitic sequences. And that's how anti-Semitism became something normal, something usual. So in the mind of people who always consider themselves as victims, Jews are too successful. For these people, the Jews don't exist. And this is what we have to fight. And that's why it's much more complicated than to simply sue someone in front of a court, to give the person a fine, or to tell him that he does something wrong. I have the feeling that today this issue is raised in the comedy shows, in the movies. The image of the successful and dangerous Jew is back. So this Jew is dominant. And as a matter of fact, he oppresses others. And amongst the people who think that Israel is a colonizing country and a state of apartheid, there are lots of people from left political parties who are very happy with this vision.
I couldn't agree more. And that's the reason why I think we must also fight regarding fictions. We must also fight on the educational level. We must have discussions to teach the people about the transmission of a memory, of a story, a memory which is a collective one. I say it again, it's the duty duty of everybody.
You are right, but I think that politicians must stop offering their condolences to the Jewish community after every terror attack targeting Jews. They should offer their condolences to the national community. We see it in their speeches. They make a difference between the people and the Jewish people.
It goes even beyond that. I saw a tweet from Eric Zemmour mentioning the innocent French people. He's using the words of former French Prime Minister Raymond Barre, which means that he wants to say that there is, on one side, the foreign delinquents, and on the other side, the innocent French people. So we must fight on the educational level. We must know our history and understand what Zemmour means when he talks about innocent French people. So we have to lead this fight at this level. But I think that it is also important on the level of fiction, derision and
Manuel
humor.
Valls nous donne son avis parce que c'est vrai qu'on parle des solutions, on cherche des solutions aujourd'hui. Bon, on a vu que la loi ne pourrait pas tout faire. Il y a aussi le problème de l'éducation, puisqu'on a vu que ce sont les jeunes générations qui sont de plus en plus touchées par cette espèce d'effacement aussi de ce qu'a été la tragédie de la Shoah. Comment aujourd'hui, Manuel Valls, on peut réfléchir à des solutions peut-être nouvelles pour relancer dans les esprits de ces jeunes qui aujourd'hui n'ont quasiment plus en face d'eux de survivants pour leur raconter ce qu'était la Shoah. Comment est-ce qu'on peut essayer de trouver de nouvelles solutions aujourd'hui ?
D'abord, il faut poursuivre le combat politique. On évoquait un humoriste américain il y a un instant.
First, we must continue the political fight. We were mentioning an American comedian, and it reminds me of the fight I led against Dieudonné a few years ago. He was very popular, very appreciated, not only by the young people from the sensitive urban zones. At the beginning of the 2000s, he would perform in concert halls filled with all kinds of people. And the fact that he was so popular is the evidence that there was a problem. So the fight has to be political, legal, and we must fight double standards.
De deux poids, deux mesures. Comment Dieudonné ne peut pas tenir des propos antisémites, mais Charlie peut s'en prendre.
For instance, I remember that I used to hear young people complaining and saying things like, why can't Dieudonné make anti-Semitic remarks while Charlie Hebdo has the right to make fun of the Prophet Muhammad? This way of thinking is very dangerous.
De mémoire. Donc ce combat, il est juridique et politique, il faut le mener. Après, c'est celui de la mobilisation. Parce que quand on a réussi à mettre à genoux Dieudonné et Soral, et d'autres, les antisémites,
most of the time, people who say that they don't really know history and have no memory. But we also have to mobilize people, because even if we were able to stop Dieudonné, Soral, and others, the anti-Semitism will find other ways. This is relativism, and relativism is harder to fight. What we have seen during the pandemic is appalling. In the beginning of the pandemic, Israel seemed to deal successfully with the virus. The population was mobilized and vaccinated before other countries in the world. But then people started making anti-Semitic remarks about that. People were almost